So, hello and welcome to what is hopefully going to be a series on Martin Heidegger's Being and Time, this edition that I got right here. And just from the get-go, I realized that this is probably not going to be really a guide to Heidegger's Being and Time or a thorough walkthrough of all its content and what it all means. Just from before, I knew that it was a very difficult book, a very difficult philosopher. And now that I'm already I believe about 100 pages in, I can already tell that if I were to do an essay or a multiple essays across the entire book to cover everything in a structured, detailed manner, trying to make everything understandable and work out what it all means and give something that I believe is sort of correct. I just don't think that's possible. It's so dense and you get stuck and hung up on so many things, and it's not always that it's difficult because of the reasons that I knew initially, the language and the topic, but also that it covers a lot of topics that you need to understand from beforehand that I didn't know about, actually know what the different Greek words how they were spelled in the original language and what they sort of signify, because here one word will be used in how it's written in Greek, I presume, but then there will be a sort of discussion of, okay, what does this word actually mean? So there is not like a set definition, but it's like a topic under discussion. And then there's some German words that I can't be bothered to translate. So the format that I'm probably going to have, just so I can get through this book without it taking a decade, is I think I'm going to just to have this sort of free-floating format with just sharing whatever thoughts I think I can say, and of course that will cover the book essentially, but only those parts that struck me, that I understood at least well enough to remember and to where I could say and that I understood well to the point that I could say something about them. Either that this I don't understand for this reason, or that, or this I found interesting for that or this reason. But I imagine that a lot of it is still going to be left out. But I think there are some things that I can say at least already. From what I've read so far. So I've made actually a little structured list so I can keep track of it for my own sake. And I thought that just the general introduction that Heidegger gives, in the very beginning of what this book is about, was very satisfying and captured one of the problem that he's trying to tackle. So what he's trying to do in this book is to get at what he calls the general question of being. What does it mean for something to be in the most general sense? And he immediately states that, well, this is a question that doesn't really make sense to us anymore, that we sort of taken aback from this question, like, first of all, what do you mean, and how can you even propose to understand something like that? It just seems like a waste of time from the beginning. Like, how can you possibly think that you can say something intelligent about this most general of all questions? What does it mean for anything to be anything? But I think he managed to articulate like this concern or this doubt that this question has any validity. And he brings it back to something that he says that Plato wrote, just to see that, or just to show that this question hasn't at the very least hasn't been something that is sort of self-evident for thinkers in for the thinkers of ancient Greece. So I thought I'd just read the first introduction, because I think it captures the task of the book pretty well. Let's see. Yeah. So it starts with a translation from Plato's The Sophists. It goes, "For manifestly you have long been aware of what you mean when you use the expression being. We, however, who used to think we understood it, have now become perplexed." End of quote. Do we in our time have an answer to this question of what we really mean by the word being? Not at all. So it is fitting that we should raise anew the question of the meaning of being. But are we nowadays even perplexed at our own inability to understand the expression being? Not at all. So first of all, we must reawaken an understanding of the meaning of this question. The aim of the following treatise is to work out the question of the meaning of being, and to do so concretely. The provisional aim of the interpretation of time as the possible horizon of any understanding whatsoever of being. But the reason for making this our aim, the investigations which such a purpose requires, and the path to its achievement, calls for some introductory remarks. And then he goes out to sort of lay his foundation for the question of being and his approach to it. And I know from listening to Hubert Dreyfus' lecture that if you go into this book and you start with the introduction, you are not going to understand anything. At least because he wrote the introduction after he wrote everything else. And so the introduction doesn't really make sense if you don't already understand the content of the book, Dreyfus said. And I wasn't completely new to all of Heidegger, because I read I should show this complementary guide to Being and Time, sort of in the same format or in the same image here. So I bought them in a set, but it's written by Magda King. This one here. So I wasn't starting from scratch, but it was still quite difficult to get through, and some stuff I'm still not getting. And so the main outline of his approach to get to the general question of being is to first get at the being who asks the question of what the general question of being is. So the question comes from a certain being, and he thinks that we should understand that being in its question of being to get at the general question of being. It's a lot of usage of the word being of this book, obviously, and I think for the future I'm going to try to separate being from beings, and when I use beings in singular, try to refer to that as entities instead, because I think it can be very confusing to follow if you don't have the text in front of you. And I think entities well enough captures what a being is as a what is a being. And he addresses some of the objections that one might have for this approach of going through the being of man, which he will call Dasein, to go through that to get at the general question of being. Because, well, if you're going to try to explain the general question of being using some specific being, aren't we carrying along some presuppositions, or the presuppositions that we'd have to carry along in that being of man? Don't they lend themselves to sort of a circular argument, in that you already have to presuppose what the being of man is, and so you have to, in that you are already setting up an answer for the general question of being. And he thinks that well, there won't be such a circular argument, because even though we do not have a concept, or we cannot even have a concept of the general concept of what being means, he still insists that we do have some preliminary understanding of being, because otherwise we would not have any type of ontological understanding at all. It would not be possible. And I don't know if I can buy that, simply because I still don't really grasp this field of ontology, what that really means. But at least he addresses the critique and admits that there is potentially something, a problem of circularity here. And he sort of already in the introduction is going to spoil what the meaning of being is, even though we won't understand what that answer really means immediately. But he's going to say from the beginning that the meaning of being is the meaning of being is temporality, or it's found in temporality. So the mode of temporality, the mode of time, has something to do with how we determine what a being is. And I guess the only way to, or one way to exemplify that is that he goes back to the Greeks and mentions that what was thought of as being in one sense was also thought as presence, as what was present in the present tense. So what is what is what is present in some way. But I know he's going to also bring up that something can be as, or the being of something can be something that is stretched along time in a way that doesn't just encompass the present, but also historical intervals. And even the future has a type of being, or the future is part of man's being in some sense, although that future is not what we think of ordinarily in time. It's not a fixed future, but more like a sense of our future self is the best way I can understand it. Yeah, and just to point out, just to say maybe again that I realized that this book was also, well, it's not meant for beginners, obviously, but it's also worth mentioning maybe that Heidegger submitted this book, this text, I think in order to gain an academic position. Like this was sort of his. I don't know if it's necessarily his dissertation, but he submitted it at least to some academic body. So he knew that whoever would read it would have a pretty high degree of knowledge in the field of philosophy, history, and all that. So he can get away with using certain references and not explaining the whole history of, say, medieval ontology or scholasticism, something like that. He doesn't bother explaining those, and if you don't know those things, then it's hard to follow some of his arguments. And there is one question that I do think he has avoided so far. Maybe if you read into it really well, you could say that he addresses it indirectly, but it's not like a chapter dedicated to this problem or even a sentence. I think that touches upon it. That is sort of what makes an entity to an entity. It talks about the general question of, okay, what does it mean for something to be? But it doesn't question, okay, what does it mean for anything to be a being? Which is something that at least seems pretty important to me. And reading through this, or trying to figure out, okay, what is ontology? What does it mean to have an ontological system, and how can they differ? What do I think when I say that something is an entity, and that entity? I don't think I have a general understanding of, or I don't have an understanding of this general question of being, which is Heidegger's whole point of the book. But I realized when I've been reading Heidegger so far that my own view of beings in the world, or like how they come to be, is that I very much cannot help to see it that, well, the beings out there that I'm gonna say out there. The reason that we experience them as separate individual entities, like this is a thing, this book is a thing, this chair is a thing, that thingness of organizing the world, to me at least, is not something that is inherent to the world. I think I'm sort of an involuntary Kantian, in that status of entity is something that we give to the world. I mean, there is nothing in itself that makes something a separate entity. To me, that's how it seems, at least. That the world itself is just a sort of dynamic field of reality, but there is no inherent structure to that. This piece of reality as its own entity, there is that process of assigning this as a thing separate from other things, is something that, well, is imposed. And I'm not really arguing for this as, well, this is how we ought to think. This is just, I'm sort of revealing my own default way of thinking about the world, I guess. And that may be good to keep in mind for the comments to come in the future for this book, because that's the view that's going to clash with Heidegger, and I'm going to I'm going to see, well, how can this view not be correct, or what is it? How, or does he address this view? And yeah, Heidegger, like I said in the beginning, think that we don't have we don't have any sense of this question of being at all. It's a question, it's completely foreign to us. And the reason is that we've had this faulty history of ontologies ever since the Greeks, really. That there's something missing from the fundament of our culture, or our history, that this question has been buried. And it's a bit strange that he starts the book with a quote that says that seems to indicate that Plato, in this case, had found or started to think about some new conception of being, but he's also pointing towards the Greeks as not having a proper understanding of being. So they asked this question, but never really got an answer to it, and then we just kept on going. And then it talks of how the medievals, or the medieval thinkers, they inherited this sort of already a bit flawed sense of ontology, but then it sort of devolved even further, becoming, as he said, mere material, and that's what we've been carrying over in modern times. So it's going to go out of his way to try to destroy this history of ontology, to see how it came about and how it developed, and it's going to argue against it. And then we have his method for doing all this. His famous, or his master's or teacher's famous invention, the method that he invented, called phenomenology. And this is something that I still really don't understand at all what he means in the end, because I could understand, I think, what I understand is that his teacher, Husserl, who invented phenomenology, his starting point was, well, human consciousness and the experiences that were possible in human consciousness. And if I go to Stanford's Encyclopedia of Philosophy, that is also sort of the definition that you get there, that it deals with what is possible as an experience to have, and it deals with those kinds of phenomenon. But Heidegger, he rejected this approach and said that, well, phenomenology doesn't have an object, it's only a method of some sort. And then it goes through the history of the words that were fused to get phenomenology, which were phenomenon and logos. And there it goes over the original Greek words and the words that were relevant to this to the understanding of phenomenon. And he gives some explanations or some definitions of phenomenon, of appearance, of semblance, that all make sense and you can understand them. And then he says that, well, phenomenology is not that. It ends with some strange definition that phenomenology is to let what is show itself on its own terms. And it's like, I have no idea what that means. For a while, it seemed like he meant what is possible to experience. So he gives an example of a fever, and that the redness of the face, maybe, or some symptom of a disease, maybe in general, and you can see those symptoms as a phenomenon, and those would be an indication of a disease which you cannot directly observe, but it announces itself through this phenomenon which can be observed. So so the disease can show itself through an appearance or something like that. It shows itself through something else which itself is not. And so it would sort of make sense that, okay, does phenomenology only deal with these symptoms in this case, the redness of the face, those sense perceptions essentially? But I think he very clearly takes on that interpretation and says that no, that's not it. So we're left with the sense of what phenomenology isn't, but not what it is. Yeah, and at the end of this the introduction, he just gives an outline to what the book is going to be about. So I think I can just quickly mention that. So it's divided into two parts, where the first one is divided into three divisions. First, the preparatory fundamental analysis of Dasein. Second is Dasein and temporality. And third is time and being. Then the second part is also divided into three ways. In here, it's more, he will actually address some other thinkers directly, which I think will be really pedagogical to have that contrast between what he says and what some other thinker says. So the first one is Kant's doctrine of the schematism of time as preliminary stage of a problem of temporality. Secondly is the ontological foundation of Descartes' cogito sum and the incorporation of medieval ontology in the problem of the res cogitans. And thirdly, Aristotle's treatise on time as a way of discerning the phenomenal basis of and limits of ancient ontology. So, and this only covers the introduction, basically, that of being in time. So I'm hoping to continue doing this video series all the way through. Hopefully, it won't be too long in between each part. But yeah, if you've stuck around so far, thanks for watching.